We need to intervene again. This is where the social services come into play. You know, my mother was a social worker growing up, and she sacrificed to make sure that my two brothers and me, along with my grandparents, could have a life. And at any point in time, we had a half dozen foster children in our home. So I understand what it's like to be in a difficult situation. And when it comes to domestic violence, we need to make certain that we provide the services immediately. So the answer is yes, we should provide those services. And yes, we should keep them in the homes as long as we can. And we ought to put in whatever protective measures that we can find to the fullest extent of the law and to the fullest capability of the Emergency Social Services Bureau that I will set up to make certain that we protect these women, and especially the women and their children who suffer from domestic violence. And unfortunately, given where we are with COVID and the mental strains that many people are undergoing, that is likely to only increase. So we need to commit to having those services available, have them paid for, and having the opportunity for our domestic violence sufferers, the victims, to have dignity and to have homes and have shelters and take care of their families.
This is actually connected to, there's so many problems with the way these rules are applied, and how they disproportionately actually harm the people that we're supposed to be serving and supporting, whether we're talking about DV survivors or even just defining homelessness, right? How you have to be seen at the same place by somebody 6 times consistently or whatever, or you can't be living on somebody else's couch and qualify as being homeless. There's a lot of things in the system that are actually set up that are not helpful. So yes, I would absolutely prioritize DV, homeless, mostly women, homeless people for those units. And I also think we do have to prioritize in cases, as you referenced, in cases where the abuser is gone. We also have to prioritize allowing survivors to stay in their homes and providing them with the supports that they need in their homes. The whole idea of displacement and transitioning actually is much more destabilizing to the survivors and their families and their children than not. And we need to prioritize actually the needs of survivors in these instances, which I don't think we've done enough of. And so I think that, being able to provide supports to people when they can stay in their homes, prioritizing their being able to stay in their homes and bringing the supports to them is a critical piece.
Domestic violence is the root cause for 41% of families in shelter, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, more people are in shelter because of domestic violence than for just ordinary eviction. And so I believe that we have to address this head on. First, we have got to reform the lease to termination laws so that survivors don't need to obtain a court order or alert their abuser to leave an unsafe home. I know how important this is because when I was in the assembly, I was one of the leading legislators on introducing laws that would protect domestic violence victims, and I've carried this with me for the last 30 years. I would also immediately increase capacity in the HRA shelter system because let's face it, survivors need to stay past 180 days. And that's why they need to get services and stability even after they leave the shelters. But we cannot put a timeline on the shelter system because everybody's situation is different. And I think we need to make it easier for survivors to get support and stay in their homes. But once they go into the shelter system, they must become a real priority. Also, there's a great piece of legislation. It's called the Hevesy-Kruger statewide Red Supplement Bill that would assist vulnerable populations. That includes survivors to create the resources that we need to help.
I grew up in a household where it wasn't until we got in our teens where domestic abuse was an everyday weekend occurrence. And it wasn't until we became old enough as boys to tell my dad that this is not happening anymore. And so I know what it is to be traumatized in that fashion. And I believe that instead of the family moving, the abusers should be moving. But we should be doing even more. We should give the family members who are abused the right to remove the abuser's name off the if it's a lease, off the lease. he or she should no longer have a right if they are abusers to be part of deeds. It's something that I pushed when I was in the state Senate. And it takes far too long for the abuser to have to pay everything from child support to his other financial obligations. The amount of time and amount of documentation one needs to prove that they are waiting for child support is unacceptable. My tenant in my home, she went through a domestic violence situation, and it took her over a year and a half to get support. And the city told me if I take her to court, they would pay me the back rent, and I refused to do that. I waited a year and a half until she was able to get on her feet beforehand, because if I would have taken her to court, it would have placed a mark on her credit report and hurt her chances to get in a lottery apartment system. And so we put too many barriers in the way of those who are the victim of domestic abuse. The city continues to abuse them, even worse than the abusers, and I would stop that as the mayor.
It is absolutely wrong that we wait until someone has already been displaced from their home because of domestic violence in order to get them help. And that's why I would fundamentally reorient our rental assistance program in this city to make it much more flexible, to ensure that we're catching families before they have to be displaced and end up in shelter. And I would make sure that those resources are specifically set aside with a reserve, a flexible reserve for domestic violence survivors. And we also know that there are many other issues related to this as well, whether it's the abusive man in the relationship being on the lease, victimizing in other ways and threatening the women in those relationships, that then ends up forcing them to leave their own homes. We also have to work much more effectively with law enforcement and ensure early on with trusted partners that we're bringing assistance and counseling that can learn earlier in ways that women who are being abused can trust, so that we can avoid being displaced and hopefully keep women and their children in their homes rather than requiring them to move in the first place.
So first of all, it should not matter whether or not the acronym of the agency is HRA or DSS, and the ability to get the 15% set aside should be open to either population. We want to make it as easy for DV survivors to have stable housing as we move forward. And in terms of staying at home, it is often, I just want to make sure that I understand this piece, the desire to stay at home. If there is an abuser involved, are we talking about the home with the abuser? If it is safe, if the abuser is no longer there, then obviously supporting people to stay in an apartment they're already in, it makes a lot more sense than trying to move people into a system that will be both really a hardship for that family, but also isn't going to make it any cheaper to find an apartment.